Use just one tool to create half square and quarter square triangles that finish to identical sizes. The No Hassle Triangles gauge makes these blocks easy to create. Here we have the No Hassle Triangle gauge, and we can make both half square and quarter square triangles using the same tool. On the left side, you'll see the icons for the half square triangle. On the right side is the icon and the measurements that you'll use for the quarter square triangles. We're going to start by showing you the half square triangles. You can see above the icon is the finished size of the block that each set of squares will make. So 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 inches, 5.5, and 6.5 inches. We're going to press the lever on the lower part of the gauge, and it just slides and locks into the various little slots to hold the gauge in place. We want to make a 3.5 inch finished half square triangle. So it's the lower part of the tool is locked in place. It's showing that we will need to cut strips and then squares at 3 7/8 inches. Here we have strips of fabric that have been cut the 3 7/8 inch wide. They've been placed right sides together, so two contrasting fabrics right sides together, and then those strips are cut into squares that are 3 7/8 inches by 3 7/8 inches. And now we're ready to mark. Here are our two squares. They're still stacked right sides together. Position the No Hassle Triangle gauge over the square, aligning the outermost corner of the tool of the gauge with the block corner. Also align the opposite corner of your stacked squares with the edges of the gauge. You're now ready to mark with an erasable marking pen or pencil in the slots that run across and up the gauge. And here we have a block that's already marked, and it's ready to be stitched. Here are our stacked squares that have been marked. We're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam that's obviously a 1/4 inch away from the marked line. So you'll use a 1/4 inch foot or a patchwork foot. Align the edge of the foot with the diagonal markings, and you'll have a 1/4 inch seam. Turn it around, and you're ready to stitch the second seam. So you'll have two stitch seams that are a 1/4 inch away from your marked center line. That marked line then becomes the cutting line, and you'll have two half square triangles stitched and cut. Our pair of stitched triangles now are ready to be pressed. Press the seam allowances to the darker side of fabric if possible, and you now have a pair of half square triangle blocks. The beauty of the No Hassle Triangle gauge is that we can create quarter square triangles blocks that are the identical size to the half square triangle blocks. Now, we showed you the half square triangle blocks just before. We're going to create a 3.5 inch finished quarter square triangle block, and the cutting measurement is different, so the slot settings are different as well. So it's very important that you set your gauge properly. We are going to cut 4 1/4 inch wide strips and then squares that are 4 1/4 by 4 1/4, and that's to allow for the extra seam allowances that are used to create the quarter square triangle block. Here we have two 4 1/4 inch wide strips of fabric. They're stacked right sides together. From that, we'll cut squares that are 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. We're actually ready to mark right away. Align the outer corner of the tool, of the gauge, with the outer corner of the block. and the opposite corner of the fabric squares aligns with the opposite corner of the gauge. You're now ready to mark the diagonal line using a erasable marking pen or pencil, and we have one already marked, ready to be stitched. Here are stacked squares. They're still right sides together, marked down the center, and ready to be stitched. It's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so use a patchwork foot or little foot or 1/4 inch foot and stitch the seam 1/4 inch away from the center line. Then you're ready to turn and stitch the second seam. So you'll have 2 stitch seams that are each a 1/4 inch away from the center marked line. That center marked line then becomes your cutting line. Cut and separate, and then you're ready to press, and we'll show you the finished half square triangles. We've pressed all our half square triangles. Nice neat seams are pressed. Then we're going to stack pairs of half square triangles together, meeting the seam edges and also aligning the outer edges. Now, if you take a measurement, you'll find that your block now measures 3 7/8 inches. So we need to make an adjustment to our no hassle triangle gauge before we do any more marking. Originally we were cutting at 4 1/4. With the seams, we now have a cut size of 3 7/8. So we're going to actually move our gauge into position for a 3 7/8. We're just skipping over momentarily to our half square triangle sizing. We now can lay the no hassle triangle gauge right on our stacked half square triangle blocks, aligning the outer corners with the gauge corners, and mark the diagonal line, which we have right here. Mark diagonal line. We're ready to stitch. Here we have our stacked blocks ready. They're marked and ready to sew. So again, you'll stitch 2 seams. Each are a 1/4 inch from the marked center line. Again, that marked center line becomes your cutting line. So once you cut them apart, imagine this is cut apart, and you'll press the block open, and you have a 1/4 square triangle. And pair it together. It's the identical size of the half square triangle. No hassle triangles gauge lets creating identically sized half square and 1/4 square blocks be easy and accurate. The illustrated detailed instructions include notes from Nancy. Purchase today and make no hassle triangle blocks your next quilt project.